Well, it's my pleasure to address the Knights of Malta at your national gathering. You're a group that I've admired over the years, so thank you for your invitation. You know, in recent weeks and months, as our country goes through this convulsive time, I can't tell you how many people have asked me, Bishop, what is going on? How do you explain what's happening on our streets? What's happening with the rhetoric people are using? What's going on in our culture? Well, there have been all kinds of analyses, political and economic and sociological. But, by training and instinct, I'm a philosopher. And philosophers always ask the fundamental questions. I think to understand what's going on, we have to put on our philosophers' caps. And so what I want to do with you in the talk today is look at this question philosophically by stepping back a bit from it. I'm going to propose to you four thinkers, two Germans from the 19th century, two Frenchmen from the 20th century, who have been extraordinarily influential on the way we think and the way we act today. And I think understanding these philosophers will help us understand what's happening in our time. Now, the four I've got in mind, I'll do them chronologically. First, Karl Marx. Secondly, Friedrich Nietzsche. Thirdly, Jean-Paul Sartre. And finally, Michel Foucault. Marx, Nietzsche, Sartre, and Foucault. I think to understand their philosophies is to understand a lot of what's going on in the academy today and also now on the streets. So let's begin with Karl Marx, undoubtedly the best known of these four figures. Now, many of us who lived through the events of the 1980s and 1990s with the downfall of the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc and so on might be forgiven for thinking that Marx was going to be placed on the ash heap of history. But Marx has been taught now for the past at least 50 years in most of the academies of the West. And as you know, he's undergoing a sort of revival today, especially among the young. And I think Marxism explains at least a fair amount of what's going on today. Just a bit about Marx personally. He was born in Trier in the western part of Germany in the year 1818. Descended on both sides of his family, by the way, from a long line of rabbis. And you will see something of the biblical prophet, I think, in Marx. And something of a, though transformed and bent out of shape, a kind of religious view of things. As a young man, he studies the fashionable Hegelianism of the time, and then very quickly drifts into radical politics. First in Germany, also in Belgium and France. He lived for a time in Paris. Because of his agitations, he was expelled from those three countries. Eventually finds his way to more tolerant England, and he settles in London. That's where he spends the rest of his life, and where he writes his major work, the famous Das Kapital. In fact, if you go to the British Museum, they'll show you to this day the desk and the chair where Marx sat and wrote Das Kapital. He dies in London in 1883, and he's buried in Highgate Cemetery there. I suppose you need no encouragement from me to see the extraordinary impact that Marx had throughout the 20th century and up till today, politically speaking. Now, there are a lot of themes in Marx's thought that we could pursue. I mean, he's one of the most written about figures in Western culture. I'll just look at a couple. The first theme in Marx I'll look at is his atheism. Now, the young Marx was a devotee of a man named Ludwig Feuerbach, and Feuerbach is quite rightly called the father of modern atheism. Most atheists you read today are echoing themes in Feuerbach. Feuerbach said that we human beings have a tendency to project outside of ourselves an idealized self-understanding. So, I'm intelligent, but I'd like to be all intelligent. I'm loving, but I'd like to be all loving. I've got some power. Boy, if I had all power. So we take this idealized self-understanding, myself as all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving, and we project it outward. We call it God. And then we spend our kind of pathetic religious lives petitioning this fictional character to give back to us what we gave to him. So Feuerbach sees religion as a kind of alienation. It's a psychological problem. Well, young Karl Marx takes this in, and all his life long, he remains a devotee of Feuerbach. In fact, he said famously, everyone must be baptized in the Feuerbach, and that means in German, the brook of fire. So everyone's got to go through this baptism into Feuerbach's atheism. Okay, but Marx asked a further question, namely, how come we human beings almost universally, think of how universally applicable religion is around the world. Why do we do it? Why do we engage in this alienating move? Marx's extremely influential answer was, because we are already so unhappy and so alienated in our economic lives, because we're so oppressed, we invent a fantasy world to live in. Hence his famous line, religion is the opium of the people. So it actually was in Marx's time, in places like London, that these opium dens were opening up. People would, retreat from the world, they take opium, they live in a fantasy world, they destroy their lives in the process. So Marx said that's most human beings. They take the opium of religion to dull their sensitivity to their suffering and to invent a fantasy world. So Marx's very influential view of what religion is and why we engage in it. Now, this gives us a clue too, and this is the second major idea I want to develop because it's hugely impactful today. Religion is part of what Marx calls the superstructure. So every society, from ancient times to the present day, Marx thought, has a substructure which is always economic. Whether it's the slave economy of the ancient world, the feudal economy of the medieval world, a serf-based economy in Russia of the 18th century, and then the capitalist economy of his own time. That's the core or the substructure of any society. But the substructure throws up around itself what he calls the superstructure. The superstructure has one purpose. It is to enhance and protect the substructure. That's its purpose. Now, what's the superstructure? Everything else in the society. So Marx says, for example, politics. What's the whole purpose of politics? And we surround it with all sorts of descriptions and honors, and we look at it in a very exalted way. But what's the purpose of politics? Is to protect the economic substructure. He would say, what do most politicians talk about most of the time but economic matters? What's the purpose of the military, which serves political interests? Well, it's to protect the capitalist system, to expand markets and to protect them in foreign environments, etc. What are wars fought over? Marx said, always over economic matters. What's entertainment's purpose? Well, to distract us from our suffering, which is why rich people often support forms of entertainment. There it's a bit like religion, the opium of the people. How about the arts? Well, the arts are part of the superstructure. The arts are, for the most part, subsidized by wealthy people, and the arts over the centuries tend to glorify those in the power structure. Okay, substructure protected by this elaborate superstructure. Now, what's the point of the Marxist intellectual is to break through the superstructure, to expose it for what it is, to break its power over us, so that we can get at the economic substructure and fight to revolutionize it. But see, we can't foster the revolution until we break through the superstructure. Now here's something just to kind of beguile you. We all know The Wizard of Oz. There's a very Marxist way to read The Wizard of Oz, where you've got the tin woodsman who stands for industry that has no heart. You got the cowardly lion. Well, he's the military that has no real courage. You've got the scarecrow. He's the farmer that has no brains. But the one I find really interesting on this Marxist reading of The Wizard of Oz is the man behind the curtain. So here's this little figure who's pulling the levers and producing this grand illusion of the Wizard of Oz. Well, who's the wizard? Well, that's probably God and religion. But Toto, the little dog, pulls back the curtain and reveals this little figure behind the curtain. Well, that's, you could say, Marx's superstructure and substructure. The idea is break through the protective shell, get to the core, and then get the revolution going. Now how? By stirring up an antagonism between oppressor and oppressed. So at the heart of the Marxist theory, and it would take us all day to go into the details of that, but at the heart of it is an oppressor-oppressed relationship. The capitalist oppressing the worker and thereby deriving profit. The Marxist revolutionary has to cut through all the superstructure and then foment the class struggle that will lead to the revolution. Now, I'm sure a lot of that is fairly familiar to you, and at the end of the talk, I'll try to pull out some implications for the present-day conversation, but I think you can begin to hear overtones in the way people are speaking and acting today. Now, the second person I want to look at is Friedrich Nietzsche. I've become convinced that this 19th century philosopher is at least as influential in our time as Karl Marx. Nietzsche, like many other modern thinkers, and this in itself is kind of an interesting theme, was the son of the parsonage. So Nietzsche's father was a Lutheran pastor. Nietzsche was born near Leipzig in 1844. Very early on, he abandoned the Christian faith he would have inherited from his father, and he became a student of classical philology. So the study of language became his preoccupation. Now, this is very interesting because you'll see now the next person I'll look at, Jean-Paul Sartre, who was deeply indebted to Nietzsche, fascinated with the power of language. In fact, his autobiography is called Les mots in French, the words. And then Michel Foucault, also deeply influenced by Nietzsche. Language is a central preoccupation of his. Notice today, and I'll come back to this, how important language is and the proper protocols and policing of language. I'll come back to that. So Nietzsche does hold a university position for a time. In fact, he's one of the youngest professors in the German system. But his rather strange personality and bad health compromised his academic career. He did most of his writing in the 1880s, so when he was in his 40s. 1889, he endures a kind of collapse, both physical and mental. People speculate what it was. Psychological illness, syphilis, brain issues, we don't really know. But for the last 10 years of his life, he lived basically in seclusion and in a kind of madness. He died in the year 1900. Now, Friedrich Nietzsche, with whom I'm in radical disagreement, but I have to say he was one of the most fecund and creative thinkers in the Western tradition. He had an extraordinarily fertile mind. He wrote somewhat in the manner of Blaise Pascal, by which I mean he wrote aphoristically, kind of short little declarations and short sentences. It makes reading him kind of interesting. It's not like plowing through a text. He does write that way sometimes, but often in this aphoristic manner. Again, thousands of ideas we could look at in Nietzsche. I'll just look at a couple that I think are very important for today. The first one, probably he's best known for this, is the death of God. Now here he's like Feuerbach and like Marx. God is dead and we've killed him. A famous line he puts in the mouth of one of the characters in Thus Spake Zarathustra. Maybe his most famous line. God is dead and we killed him. What I want to explore, though, is the implication he draws from this truth. So we saw what Marx did with the non-existence of God. What does Nietzsche do? He draws the conclusion that the foundation for meaning, truth, and value, that it held sway in the West really from biblical times and from ancient times to the present, was now giving way. Now, what do I mean here? Well, for most of Western thought, both theological, coming up out of the Bible, and philosophical, coming up out of ancient Greece, for most of Western thought, God serves as the foundation for objective truth and objective moral value. God is the logos, or the supreme reason. God is the summum bonum, the ultimate good, and in God, all the truths and goods that we intuit about the world are finally grounded and find their justification. So, if there's no God, God is dead and we killed him. If there's no God, then there's no foundation for the claim that there are objective truths and objective moral values. All of that gives way as well. What are we left with? What Nietzsche calls perspectivism. My perspective on it, your perspective on it, his perspective, her perspective, all these millions of perspectives. In our language today, we might say, well, it's my truth, and you got your truth, and she's got her truth over there. But there's nothing like the truth to which we are all beholden. Well, there's my set of values. From my perspective, I see it this way. You've got your set of values, but there's no such thing as the valuable, the good in itself. The death of God has led to a radical relativizing of truth and moral value. Okay, what does Nietzsche recommend in light of this situation? He recommends that we face this world of no objective truth and no objective value with the power of the will. I assert my will to power. So yes, in the face of this bleak situation, I assert my own will. Hence, Nietzsche became a harsh critic of the morality coming up out of the Christian tradition. Now, why? Well, our morality puts a stress on pity, on compassion, on love, on forgiveness, on nonviolence. What is that on Nietzsche's terms but a slave morality? It's a resentful morality. Those who have not effectively asserted their will to power, those who've been put down, are now kind of urging the powerful people to, be nice to us, forgive us, have pity for us. Says Nietzsche, slave morality. Rather, assert your will to power. Now, this does lead to a kind of Hobbesian world of clashing wills. I mean, because I got mine, you got yours. There's no really objective measure by which we can determine which of us is more right or more justified. And so you've got a clash of powerful wills. Leading to, again, a very influential idea of Nietzsche's, of the Übermensch in his German. Superman, it's often translated, the overman. Well, here's the hero. And it's reflected, he thinks, in some of the best of the Greek and Roman myths. The great heroic figure who stands up and asserts himself. Yes, in the kind of howling winds of this world of no objective truth and value, but asserts the primacy of will. Now, I'll come back to this, but that issue of the primacy of will over reason, I think, is visible on the streets of our cities today. Okay? And with that, I want to move to this third figure. So the first two Germans from the 19th century. The next two are Frenchmen from the 20th century. And the first is probably the most famous philosopher of the 20th century. Probably most of us in at least Philosophy 101 would have had some exposure to this figure. I'm talking about Jean-Paul Sartre. Now, Sartre was very influenced by Nietzsche. Nietzsche's impact on the 20th century is enormous. Think of his influence on someone like Martin Heidegger and all those that come out of the Heideggerian school. But his influence on the two I'll look at next, Sartre and Foucault, was enormous. A bit about Jean-Paul Sartre. Born in Paris in 1905. He studies at the École Normale Supérieure, the Superior Normal School. That was about 10 minutes from the house that I lived in when I was a doctoral student in Paris. It's the cream of the crop of the French intellectual system, the education system. So the best and brightest figures in the 20th century tended to be what they call normaliens, normalians, right? Students at the École Normale. So Sartre studies there. He then enters into the French educational system. So the graduates typically then would be sent out to lycée, we call them high schools, and then they'd move up through the system. And so Sartre did that for a time, but then eventually left it behind and becomes, by the 1940s and 50s and onward, maybe the paradigmatic public intellectual. So, and he's more than a philosopher. Sartre is also a playwright and a novelist, a social commentator, a man of the mind, but also a man of social action. His greatest work, undoubtedly, is, we call it in English, Being and Nothingness, L'être le néant, being and non-being. He was involved famously in the Résistance, right, the resistance to the Nazis during World War II. Sartre dies in Paris in 1980. Now, to understand his thought, I think there's a really good place to go. It's a little book he wrote. It appeared in 1946, and it's called Existentialism is a Humanism. Existentialism, so he's the founder of this famous philosophy. Existentialism is a humanism. It's a little book based on a lecture he gave right after the war. So I think it was in late 1945, and it was there in the Latin Quarter, and it was at the height of the kind of cafe philosophers and so on. And Sartre gives this lecture, and it becomes the basis for this book. And it's a very pithy and well-written book, too. Not true of all of Sartre's writings, but this one I find very easy to read. And the central idea of his existentialist philosophy is clearly articulated. And here's how he does it. By existentialism, I mean the view that existence precedes essence. The view that existence precedes essence. Now, I know that sounds desperately abstract, but it's actually a pretty straightforward idea. By essence, Sartre means that whole system of ideas and patterns and ideals and forms by which an individual and a society typically would be governed. So, what does it mean to be human? Well, there's kind of an essential pattern that's been presented, by philosophers and by theologians and by the state. What does it mean to lead a good life? Well, listen to all these representatives of these essential forms, and they'll tell you what that looks like. What's the drama of life? Well, to bring existence, and by existence he means my individual self, especially my freedom, to bring existence into line with essence, right? So you're a little kid, you're trying to learn to be a responsible adult. Well, all kinds of people will tell you, here's what it looks like. Here's the essential form of being human. Now bring your freedom, your individuality, your existence into line with essence. So you see, on the classical reading, essence precedes existence. See what I mean? Precedes it both kind of chronologically and ontologically, meaning there's kind of a superiority to essence over existence. My life is to kind of accept in a humility of spirit the objectivity of these essential principles. Okay, Sartre says, my philosophy is a Copernican revolution. My philosophy is going to turn that upside down because I say existence precedes essence. Now, you see what he means? A plague on your essential forms, a plague on your idea of what the good life is. What comes first is existence. That means my individuality, especially my freedom. And then, on the basis of that freedom, I determine who I will be. I determine the form or pattern of my life. You don't tell me how to live. No institution, no society, no church tells me how to live. I will decide how to live. Existence precedes essence. Existentialism. In light of that, and that's Sartre's little book, In light of that, we can understand more clearly his big book, L'être et le néant, being and nothingness. You think, okay, nothingness. Is he a nihilist? Well, he's a Nietzschean in the sense that he is indeed denying the objectivity of these intellectual truths and moral values. But see how Sartre understands le néant, the non-being, the nothing, not as something oppressive and negative, but kind of like a blank canvas. There's no objective truth or value, so I can invent it. I can paint my own beautiful picture according to my lights on the blank canvas of le néant, of the nothing. Just as in Nietzsche, this death of God opens up this space into which the will to power can assert itself, so now in Sartre, it opens up the space for existence, for my self-assertive freedom to say, here's who I am. Here's what I'm about. Again, I'll come back to this in a little bit, but I hope you can see all kinds of overtones for the way an awful lot of people think today. In fact, I've said for years that what was once whispered in the cafes of Paris, this idea, is now the default position of most young people today. Don't tell me who I am. Don't tell me what to believe. Don't tell me how to behave. I decide. The assertion of my liberty, my existence, that precedes essence. You know, here's a final connection. Marx was an atheist. Nietzsche's atheist. Sartre is aggressively atheist. Now, how come? Well, he puts it in a very pithy formula in Existentialism is a Humanism. Here it is. If God exists, I cannot be free. But I am free. Therefore, God does not exist. That's a pithy little syllogism. But you see what it rests upon. To some degree, the political structure represents essence, right? It tells you who you should be, how you should behave. To some degree, the family represents essence to us. To some degree, the culture represents essence to us. But what is the ultimate representative, the ultimate avatar of essence? But God. God, and again, traditionally, the ground of objective truth and moral value, proposes to us this essential form of life that we ought to conform to. Therefore, if God exists, Sartre says, I can't really be free. God's the ultimate limit to my freedom. Therefore, as I discover the primacy of my freedom, of my existence, I realize God does not exist. God's the ultimate threat to the Sartrean program. And so he deeply perceived. And that leads me to the final of these four players, namely Michel Foucault. This final player is perhaps the least known of the four, but he is, I would argue, perhaps the most directly influential on the present-day conversation and the present-day praxis. In some ways, Foucault represents, by the way, his name is spelled F-O-U-C-A-U-L-T, Michel Foucault. In some ways, he represents the summing up of the three figures we've already looked at. Just a bit about him personally. He was born in Poitiers in 1926, so now we're getting closer to our own time. Like Sartre, he was a normalien, so he studied at the École Normale, and he was, at the very height of the French educational system. Taught for some years in that system afterwards, but he also taught at the University of Uppsala in Sweden in the 60s. During the 60s and 70s, Michel Foucault produced a series of books that were sensations in France. Even though they were extremely complicated, some became bestsellers. And then they became very well known around the Western world. His famous studies, and I'll get into some of this, of sexuality, of madness, and incarceration were very widely read. He died young. He was only 57 when he died in 1984. I can tell you, I came to France in 1989 to begin my doctoral studies. And, in Paris, I used to say that every block has got a restaurant and a bookstore. They want to feed your body and they want to feed your mind. Well, looking out of the window of practically every bookstore that I would go to in the late 80s was the owlish visage of Michel Foucault. He had this striking face, bald head, and these little glasses, and sort of an intense expression. So he was very much of a player in those years that I was in Paris. His writing is dense, his thought is notoriously complicated, but I think it's fair to say the main lines of his philosophy can be articulated fairly simply. In the books that I just described, he engages in what he himself called an archaeology of knowledge. And it's a very interesting way to look at it. So think of an archaeological dig. So you begin on the surface, right? What's there today? As you dig down in the same location, you're going to come to an earlier version of that place. And then you dig down more to an even earlier version of that city. And then you dig down, and you go through various layers in the same spot, but yet different incarnations, if you want, of that same place. So that's a master metaphor for the kind of work he does. Now, here's the way it typically works in Foucault. Take something like sexuality. So you begin on the surface and say, well, what does our society today say about sexual behavior? What's acceptable, what's unacceptable, what's okay, what's not, etc. Well, then dig down below that to earlier expressions of what we thought was right, wrong, acceptable, unacceptable. Then dig down deeper, go all the way down to ancient times. And what you'll find, Michel Foucault typically would say, is an extraordinary variety. What we say now is good and right and appropriate sexually, well, wasn't true, let's say, in ancient times. And, he shows that in great detail, that go back to ancient Rome, ancient Greece, their sexual mores were certainly not the same as ours. Now, the same with something like incarceration. He was fascinated by that. Why do we punish certain people? What crimes are punishable? And why do we, let's say, punish with capital punishment certain things? And why do we incarcerate for certain periods of time? Well, the same thing obtains, he thought. Start today and the way we think about those issues. But then keep digging. Go back in time. Go back to the 19th century. Go back to the 17th century. Go back to the Middle Ages. Go back to ancient times. You're digging in the same place, so to speak. You're digging on this issue of incarceration, but you're coming to all kinds of different ways of understanding it. Issue after issue, that's what he typically does. Now, two observations. First, it's to some degree in service of the Nietzschean idea, and Foucault is very influenced by Nietzsche, that there really is nothing like objectively true and good states of affairs. So clearly, this is the right way to think about sexuality or the right way to think about incarceration, because he says, look, we've thought about them differently all throughout our history. So it is in service of a kind of Nietzschean relativism or perspectivism. Okay, but here's the second thing. Foucault isn't satisfied with that. He asks the follow-up question. Well, how do you account for these differences? How come one society thinks about it this way, the next society another way, and our society a third way? How do you explain that? Here's his basic answer, now repeated over and over again in his writings. It's become a master idea on the scene today. And this, again, is very Nietzschean in inspiration. Finally, Foucault argues, it's a function of power. Those who are in power will arrange things, states of affairs, and even more importantly, they will organize language in such a way as to keep themselves in power. Now, I say language, his preferred phrase is modes of discourse. In other words, there's a way of talking about things, whether it's sexuality, it's who's insane and who's not, who should be incarcerated, who shouldn't be, any other issue. There's a way of talking about those issues that aren't reflective of some objective state of affairs, some objectively right or wrong, but are rather functions of the drive to power. One class of people that finds itself in power will do all they can to maintain themselves in power. They will indeed manipulate circumstances, but more importantly, they will manipulate language so as to maintain themselves in power. So again, this is Michel Foucault's way of thinking about it. Heterosexuals will tend to demonize homosexuals condemn homosexuality. Now, why? Because, well, clearly one's right, one's wrong. No, he would say, in order to maintain their own societal dominance. Males will characterize females as misbegotten or incomplete versions of males, and that's true up and down, much of the tradition, so that they, the males, might remain in charge. Whites stigmatize blacks, first as slaves and then maybe less dramatically as social inferiors, in order to maintain white supremacy. I wonder if that sounds at all familiar to you. Most of this, Foucault thinks, is done unconsciously rather than consciously. And I was just sort of suggesting the way it happens consciously, that people will arrange things a certain way, or they will consciously change language. But it's fair to say he thinks most of it's done unconsciously. Just the way that, I'll inherit a language long before I begin to speak it in any distinctive or creative way, right? I'm speaking English now, but I inherited English with all of its rules and all of its presuppositions. So in a similar way, Foucault thought, people in a given society will inherit modes of discourse, ways of talking about things. So what's a large part of the program for him? And again, this is rather Nietzschean. A large part of the program is to see the play between oppressor and oppressed, to uncover these dynamics, and to see how the modes of discourse we use are enforcing or propagating these forms of oppression. You might say it's Nietzsche's will to power, but with a greater stress placed on the injustice of the power relationship. So for Nietzsche, you've just got clashing wills to power. Foucault, and I think it's a bit of a contradiction in his system, because he sees this kind of oppression as bad. Well, you just told me there really is no objective moral value. Isn't that an objective moral value? But that's for another day. But he does want to unmask these forms of oppression and to see the ways that language contributes to all of it. Okay, so we looked at Marx, we looked at Nietzsche, looked at Sartre, looked at Foucault. Can I suggest now, by way of conclusion, how all these figures are indeed influencing the present conversation and some of the present activity that we see? Maybe first this observation. As a student and teacher of philosophy for many years, I've always resented the claim that, philosophy, that's all these abstract ideas, has nothing to do with the real world. Come on. If there's one thing that history has proven, is that ideas have consequences. It might take time, but the ideas I've been rehearsing here, this sort of farrago of ideas from these four figures, have definitely found their way into the academies of the West. And through those academies have indeed influenced now several generations of people. I think what we see on the scene in many ways today are these ideas incarnating themselves. So don't poo-poo philosophy. I mean, philosophy might take time, but it does have a practical consequence. So let's go back now to each one of them and just very briefly pull out some of these implications. From Karl Marx, what do we see? I think we see, perhaps above all, an antagonistic social theory. A social theory of antagonism. For Marx, the only way profit can be derived is through some kind of oppression, the capitalist oppressing the worker. The revolution is all about calling attention to this oppressive relationship and leading, finally, a violent revolution of the oppressed against their oppressor. The role of the Marxist intellectual is to break through the superstructure, is to reveal these dynamics and to foster revolution. Violence for a Marxist is not a regrettable side effect. In a way, violence is the point, right? You want to foment the class struggle. You want to foment these antagonisms. The second major theme is the one I was dwelling on a bit, that substructure, superstructure, so important. Marx has been called, it was Paul Ricoeur, the philosopher, that came up with this term. He's been called a master of suspicion. Ricoeur thought Freud was a master of suspicion too, so was Nietzsche. The idea is that, yeah, I know things look this way, but what's really going on is something more fundamental and usually more nefarious. So I know things look kind of nice on the surface, the arts and politics and religion and so on. But what's really going on is this kind of grubby substructure. I'd submit to you, everybody, that you can hear this rhetoric and see the praxis that flows from it today. We need to smash through elements of the superstructure to get at the kind of grubby substructure. How about now from Friedrich Nietzsche? Well, I would say this. We find clearly today, at least in the minds of some, the rejection of God and the related calling into question of the objectivity of truth and moral value. Once these have been cleared out, indeed, what's left is a play of powerful forces, a clash of wills. Have you noticed this? And I do a lot of work on the internet where I try to engage in argument, appealing to something like a common set of norms and values. Gosh, how difficult it is in the social media world to get a real argument going. Well, why? Because people have denied the objectivity of truth and value. So what's there to argue about? All that's left is a play of wills, a clash of powerful wills. How about this, everybody? I watch the movies because the movies are such an indicator of where a popular culture is going. And one thing I found is in almost every movie, the climax is the hero or heroine finding his own voice, finding her voice and her will. There's never a question of, well, is it the right voice? Is it a good expression of the will? Is it corresponding to some objective value? No, it's, I've found who I am. I'm standing. Well, see, that's the Nietzschean space, if you want. There is no objective truth or value, but there is the heroic assertion of the will. That's the Nietzschean program, if you want. How about from Jean-Paul Sartre? Well, what I've often termed the culture of self-invention. That's an entirely Sartrean idea. And the culture of self-invention is rampant today. As I suggest, it's the default position, I think, of most younger people. If essence has disappeared, so remember Sartre, existence precedes essence. Existence comes first, my freedom, my will, and then I determine who I am. Well, if essence is evanesced, then everything, from sexuality, gender, human nature, moral systems, are finally just social constructs. They're the inventions of people's wills, so they can be overturned by the heroic, self-assertive freedom. Again, speaking of movies, watch the movie, won the Academy Award for Best Picture in 2018, called The Shape of Water. I don't know if you saw that movie. It's not very good. But when I finished seeing it, I turned to the person next to me and said, trust me, it's going to win the Academy Award for Best Picture. I just knew it because it checked every box of this system. Remember the story is about this woman, this kind of mousy woman, not very confident, and then she finds her voice and finds her freedom, and she falls in love romantically with a fish man. I'm not making this up. That's the movie, right? But here's what's interesting about that. The shape of water. Well, what shape does water have? It doesn't have any shape. Water is just fluid. It's infinitely malleable. It has whatever shape you want to give it, right? You want to put it in a bowl, you want to put it in a glass. Water is malleable. There's nothing substantial about it. It has the shape that you give it. That's Jean-Paul Sartre. That's existentialism. My freedom comes first. Everything else follows. Do you remember there was a interviewer that went to a university campus some years ago and was interviewing people. And the guy was a young man, 6 feet tall, maybe 30 years old. And he was asking people on campus, now, if I said that I'm a woman, would you be okay with that? And they, oh, yeah, sure, as long as that's what you claim to be. And then he said, now, what if I said I'm a Asian woman? Would you agree with that? And they said, well, yeah, if that's the identity that you claim, sure. Then the last question, which did give them some pause, I must say, he said, what if I claimed that I was a 6'5" Asian woman? And they hesitated a little bit, but at the end of the day, most of them said, yeah, if that's what you claim to be, that's who you are. Well, you know what that is, everybody? That's the shape of water. That's Sartrean existentialism run amok. If existence precedes essence, my freedom comes first, I determine who I am, well, why not? Why not? A 30-year-old, 6-foot-tall Caucasian man can be whatever he wants. That's the victory of existence over essence that's on the scene today. Finally, from Michel Foucault, who, as I said, I think sums up the three previous figures. I think this viewpoint today gets its deep preoccupation with language and the policing thereof. You know, in a way, Foucault combines the antagonistic social theory of Marx with Nietzsche's great stress on power. So as I say, he sees that the play of wills is the play of oppressor and oppressed, with the oppressor using language as a prime weapon. And so can you see this extraordinary interest today in the way we talk and how groups perceived to be powerful use language to keep other people at bay or under control? All the talk about microaggressions and triggers and disguised sexism, racism, homophobia, transphobia, most of it carried by language. That's all right out of the Michel Foucault playbook. Okay, I'm going to bring the talk to a close. You have to invite me back to give a full sort of ecclesial response to all this. But let me just say a couple things as I bring it to a close. I hope it's clear that as I lay out these four thinkers, and mind you, every one of them has very interesting and fascinating things to say. I'm not in a one-sided way just trying to dismiss all these thinkers. But I hope it's clear that, generally speaking, the church stands athwart almost all of this. How come? First of all, because we speak of God. What's one thing that all four of these thinkers, Marx, Nietzsche, Sartre, Foucault, have in common? The denial of God. And I think you see why. If God exists as the supreme truth and value, then there's an objective ground for these things. Key to all four of these systems is a kind of dismantling of the objectivity of truth and value. Therefore, the institution that speaks most clearly of God is going to stand athwart this point of view. And then by extension, that speaks of objective truth and moral value. That's going to be problematic. Next, Marx and Foucault as well, Sartre too in his own way, have an antagonistic social theory. There's a kind of essential struggle involved in the social order. The whole point of the Marxist revolution is to foment this class struggle. The church proposes in its social teaching a cooperative social theory, not an antagonistic one. Doesn't see violence as the means to effecting social change, but rather cooperation. Maybe most profoundly, the church, as Jean-Paul Sartre correctly saw, is the supreme representative of essence, of the precedence, if you want, of essence over existence. The drama, the adventure is not, finding my freedom and asserting it. No, the drama, the glory, the fun of life is bringing my freedom onto line with these great and beautiful and compelling intellectual and moral values that stand outside of me, that draw me to themselves. See, I've always found Sartrean existentialism, with its roots in these earlier thinkers, as finally a deeply dull system. Because you take away the compelling power of these great objective values. All I'm left with is the boring little space of my self-assertive ego. Ho-hum. This little tiny world that I'm living in. No, I'm much more interested, to use von Balthasar's language, in the theodrama, not the boring little ego drama that I'm in charge of and it's my ideas and my goals. Who cares? But the theodrama, where this world of objective value is drawing me to itself, and then behind that realm of objective value is the supreme truth and value of God. That's not oppressive to my freedom. That awakens and invites and lifts me up in my freedom. See, Sartre knew that, everybody. He knew the church stood athwart the system. We still do. Can you see now, I'll close with this, why so many of the forces influenced by these thinkers don't like us? I mean, it's not just because they've got some little cultural hang-up. No, they know that Catholicism, above all, stands athwart these philosophical assumptions. So it's good for us to know, I think, where a lot of this ideation today comes from, to step back and look at these philosophical sources, but also to claim our own great tradition as the best way to stand against it. And God bless you.